What's up guys, this is Preheat. I am the Wowhead Guide Writer for Fire and Frost Mage, and today we'll be covering Fire Mage in 9.2. This video is meant to be an overview of Fire Mage and is part 1 of 2. Today we're going to be covering the best Covenants, Conduits, Soulbinds, legendaries, trinkets, stats, talents. We'll also be talking about cooldowns and the rotation. We have a lot to talk about, so let's go ahead and get started. Now with every new patch comes a lot of uncertainty, but at this point I think we have a pretty good idea of what's good. We're going to start off with the new stuff in 9.2. So first off, tier bonuses are back. Fire 2-piece bonus increases the duration of combustion by 4 seconds. Note that this only applies to combustion that we cast ourselves, more on that later. The 4-piece bonus makes it so that our Phoenix Flames and Fire Blast recharge 50% faster during combustion. Basically, these bonuses make it so we no longer have to hold Phoenix Flames for combustion, and they also make our combustion stronger, which makes it even better to have higher combustion uptime. So speaking of combustion uptime, in 9.2 there are 2 main legendaries to use. Sun King's Blessing, or SKB as I'll call it for the rest of the video, is one. You mainly use that for raid, and you can also use it for Mythic Plus. And then Disciplinary Command is the other legendary. That's the one you may be more familiar with if you played before this patch. So Sun King's Blessing is our legendary that was bugged for over half the expansion, but now it's been buffed, it's been hotfixed, and combustion is now buffed by our tier bonuses. So it's strong enough to basically be our default option in raid and probably the best in Mythic Plus as well. Sun King's Blessing makes it so that we get a mini combustion every time we consume 8 hot streaks and hardcast either a Pyroblast or a Flame Strike. Note that this combustion benefits from the 4-piece bonus, but not from the 2-piece bonus, so you won't have the increased 4 seconds on SKB. It's not entirely clear what the best legendary for Mythic Plus is, but with the appropriate coordination, it seems so far like SKB is indeed better, but it requires practice with your team in order to fully utilize it. Disciplinary Command is our best legendary for AOE if you aren't doing keys where the pulls last long enough to get the full value from SKB. It's also way easier to use, so if you're having trouble with SKB, there's really no shame in using it over SKB. Basically, this legendary gives us a crit damage bonus for 20 seconds if we use Frost, Arcane, and Fire spells within 10 seconds of each other. It also has a 30-second cooldown, which means it's basically up 66% of the time, whether or not you're using it correctly, so it's very easy to use. The downside of this legendary is that you need to keybind Frostbolt if you haven't already, since you'll actually be using it with this legendary. The only raid encounter I really recommend this legendary for is Artificer Zymox, specifically as Night Fae. For talents, I'm only going to cover the main ones. If you want more information on talents, feel free to check out my Wowhead guide on talents in the description below. Okay, so for talents, I recommend this setup generally, but I will kind of explain some of the caveats here. So for the first row, the 15 row, Firestarter is better if you're delaying your combustion on the pulse. So that's going to be fights like Lahuvam, possibly Anduin if you're playing fire on that fight. But typically I would, recommend going with Searing Touch otherwise. For the next 4 rows, I think it's pretty much a lock-in for Shimmer, Rune of Power, Flame On for next speed. There's obviously cases where you may want to take other talents, especially on this utility row here with Ring of Frost and Ice Ward. But, you can pretty much just go with this setup here and not really think about it too much. Of course, if you want to know more about these talents, definitely visit my Wowhead guide for more information on them. So for the 45th row and the last row, the 50th row, there's a little bit of wiggle room here. So if you're doing some AOE, you may want to go with Flame Patch, but I typically don't really recommend Flame Patch unless you're playing Night Fae, because that's, when you would AOE most of the time. Just keep it locked in on Conflagration if you're playing Venthyr generally, unless you know what you're doing. And then on the 50th row, Pyroclasm versus Kindling. This is something that actually has... there's a lot of reasons why you may choose one or the other. Okay, so for Kindling is going to make your combustion a shorter cooldown. This is great for combustion uptime. It probably sims a little higher for you if you're simming your character. But in practice, if you're delaying your combustion ever, you aren't really going to be getting the benefits of Kindling really the way you should. Also, it's going to make PI timing a little bit weird if people are giving you PI. So I would say, as just kind of a general rule, and obviously this is generalized, right? This isn't specific. Pyroclasm, if you're getting PIs, or if you're doing a fight where you can use combustion every 2 minutes easily. And then Kindling, if the fight demands you have combustion up more, like so, for instance, with Jailer, right? Like if you're doing the pools, and it's slightly less than 2 minutes on Mythic that you're doing the pools, you're probably going to want to go Kindling and, still get PI, even though you're playing Kindling, okay? So there's no set in stone rule for Pyroclasm versus Kindling. Just, it pretty much just depends on whatever the fight is, depends on your raid, depends on if you're getting PI, depends on what the encounter is, and it also depends on your character stats as well. Your stats can actually impact this as well. But I think typically, though, Kindling does sim a little higher in some cases, but I've also seen sims where Pyroclasm is higher, so it really just depends. If you're playing Night Fae, though, I typically recommend that you just play Kindling, just across the board. The best covenants for Fire Mage in 9.2 are Venthyr and Night Fae. Venthyr is generally better in Sepulchre of the first ones, especially if you have access to Power Infusion. And then outside of Raid, Night Fae is generally better, especially in AoE, or for encounters with AoE like Zymox, or encounters where you need combustion on a certain cooldown, really rapid combustions like Lahuvum. We're no longer confined to just one covenant. You can play only one covenant if you want, but you won't do as well across all content. So first off, Venthyr have an ability called Mirrors of Torment. Mirrors of Torment is an ability that basically gives a debuff that has 3 stacks. Whenever a stack is consumed because the target attacks, casts a spell, uses an ability, or just does anything in general, we're going to gain 6 seconds back of cooldown reduction, and the enemy is also going to receive some other debuffs. So that's going to be 6 seconds of cooldown reduction on Fire Blast, which is great for us. If the target dies before the stacks are consumed, however, though, you will gain 0 benefit from it, so you always want to cast the spell on the target that will survive long enough to consume all of the stacks. Fire Mages also have a conduit called Siphoned Malice, which basically gives us a small damage amp whenever a stack is consumed. Venthyr Fire Mages also get access to Door of Shadows, an ability that basically gives us a teleport that we have to cast that goes 35 yards. It's basically a little under the distance of 2 shimmers. So it could also be used back-to-back if you have a specific Soulbind with Dietar. So Doors of Shadow is very useful, and you know, it's something you should definitely use, but you have to remember to use it. That's the big thing. For Soulbinds, Venthyr want to go with Dietar because his party favors T is just really strong. I recommend going with the double door Soulbind as well, since it helps a ton, and you know, having the second charge of Door Shadows is great. I recommend the Soulbinds and Conduits you can find here. If you like, you can pause, or you can look in the description below for that information. So for Night Fae, we have an ability called Shifting Power. Shifting Power is fantastic for Fire Mages since it offers cooldown reduction. Fire Mages have multiple short cooldowns such as Fire Blast, Phoenix Flames, Rune of Power, Dragon's Breath, and Combustion, so this is huge for us. The downside is that it has only an 18-yard range, which means that we basically lose damage if we play outside of this range of the boss. Night Fae Fire Mages can also use Soul Shape, a movement speed increase with a built-in teleport you can use every few seconds. This is an amazing tool, but Fire Mage already has a reasonable amount of movement. So, you know, with Blink, Shimmer, Scorch, Phoenix Speed, more mobility is always welcome, but it's not necessarily needed. For Soulbinds, Dreamweaver has a cheat death in Pod Tender, and it also has a haste buff when using Shifting Power. The other 2 Soulbinds are also pretty strong for this one, so there's really no bad option here, but I recommend Dreamweaver. Recommended Soulbinds and Conduits can be found here if you'd like, so you can pause or just look in the description below. So for other covenants, you can go those, but honestly, if you're serious about Fire Mage, I recommend just playing Venthyr and Night Fae. As far as conduits go, once again, if you want more information, more in depth, just, you know, click the link to the Wowhead guide in the description below. I'm only going to be covering the ones that are important for us to cover, okay? So Infernal Cascade is a very strong conduit. It basically gives us the same feeling as Blaster Master from the past, which gives us like a stacking buff that we maintain during combustion. We also have Controlled Destruction, which is just more damage on Pyroblast. You know, we love to see more damage on Pyroblast always. And, you know, if you're playing Venthyr, you also have Siphon Malice, which is that stacking damage buff that I was talking about before. This one's also very great. And then if you are Night Fae, you also have access to Discipline of the Grove, which basically just gives us more cooldown reduction whenever we use our Shifting Power. The only real wiggle room in the potency conduits is Master Flame, which is one that we would use in AoE mostly. And you'd probably sub that out for Controlled Destruction or one of the Covenant-specific conduits. But I would typically only recommend that for Night Fae because that's probably when you're doing AoE, right? But if you don't know what you're doing with Master Flame, then probably just stick with Infernal Cascade, Controlled Destruction, and Discipline of the Grove. For Finesse Conduits, you want to go with, you know, one of these. Obviously, they all have their own benefits. So Flow of Time is really strong since it gives us basically more cooldown reduction on Shimmer. So we always love to see that. Incantation of Swiftness is going to be basically like a short sprint that we can use. We just use invisibility and it gives us a really nice sprint. And then we also have Grounding Surge, which is really strong in Mythic Plus, since having cooldown reduction on your interrupt is, you know, it's pretty good. For Endurance Conduits, Cryo Freeze is going to be basically a massive heal. It goes above 100%. as you get those levels into the Conduit, and you know, it only affects you during Ice Block, but it's nice to be able to get healed while you're in your Ice Block. The other three are also, you know, they're all decent here with the Endurance Conduits. I'm not really going to talk about them too much though, because they're all kind of the same thing. It's just like minor healing. Okay, let's talk about stats. So stats are always kind of a weird thing to talk about because every character is different. I always just recommend that you sim your own character when it comes to your stats and just use a decision based off of what gear you have available in your bags. The best way to do that is to download the Simulation Craft add-on and then type /SIMC in your chat bar. After that, paste the output into raid bots and then do a best gear comparison and just look at whatever you have in terms of your choices, right? Based off of the gear that's in your bags. For a general rule, basically you want Intellect and Haste. Those are like your best two stats. You want to avoid crit. But there is a theoretical best stat setup, and that's what we're looking at on this weird little tool right here. So this is Bloody Mallet, and basically what we're looking at is the stat distributions. Basically what's showing us is all of these different distributions of stats and the quote-unquote best setup here. So obviously you can see that this is a pretty good setup. It says basically 10% crit, 50% haste, 30% mastery, 10% versatility. These are all in reference to each other, right? So basically, if you count them up, it goes to 100, right? So 50 plus 30 plus 10 plus 10, that's going to be 100. So this is not, you know, 10% on your character sheet, right? It isn't 10% crit on your character. You can't get that low, right? Because Fire has crit built into it. What it's saying is that 10% of your stat budget is dedicated to crit. That's why it says 246 crit, 246 versatility, and then the rest into haste and versatility. Now, these are actually color-coded based off of how good they are. So basically, all of the ones in orange are also pretty good. As you can see, you know, there's different distributions here, but all of them favor haste. Haste is the big thing that they all kind of have in common. Now, keep in mind that stats do diminish as you get more of those stats. So that's why, you know, the best one isn't just this top one on the haste here. It's going to be somewhere kind of in between. But typically speaking, you know, you don't really have the ability to choose your stats with this level of detail. So just go with haste and avoid crit. Those are just the two best rules for you if you want to succeed when it comes to your character stats. All right, so for trinkets, you're pretty much just going to want the first sigil. That's a very, very strong on-use trinket. Basically, it has a 5-minute cooldown, but it gives you a ton of verse. Basically, it gives you like 20% verse, 20 to 30%. You take a lot less damage during it. You do more damage. It's great. It's especially powerful if a fight is very short or if a fight goes a little bit over 5 minutes or 10 minutes, because essentially you get, you know, a whole 5 minutes of cooldown use out of it, which is great. But for the other trinket, you're just going to want to go with something like a stat stick. Unbound Changeling is great as your second trinket, or, you know, something like the Elegy of the Eternals. This is one that just gives you secondary stats. Pretty much anything that just gives you passive stats is good as a second trinket. So the arena one is also pretty good. I don't recommend going with the IQD. I know that the IQD sims the highest here. This is Bloody Mallet sims here, but I do not recommend IQD. I think it's a giant bait. Do not use this trinket, in my opinion. I would definitely pass on it. Just go with the first sigil. It is much more reliable. And yeah, basically you aren't going to have healers taking your trinket for mana. You aren't going to have tanks taking it because they're dead. You know, all this other cringe stuff that can happen with the IQD isn't going to happen to you. Because, you know, most of the time whenever you use IQD, unless you're really careful, you're just going to get RNG'd out of basically a whole trinket use. So yeah, don't do IQD, just stick with first sigil. That's pretty much the best trinket to go with. As far as other trinkets go, you know, I talk about them more in the guide here, but, you know, the other trinkets, you can always go with the PvP badge. That one's pretty good. If you don't have one of those, you know, if you have a Shadow Orb of Torment from last tier, that one's also pretty good. But just try to get your hands on the first sigil if you can. Okay, so now you know how to build your Fire Mage, but do you know how to play it? So I have other guides that go into the rotation in more detail. Also, stay tuned for part 2 where I cover this in more depth, but here we're just going to be covering the basics, okay? So Fire's rotation is all about generating hot streaks and getting the most out of your combustions. One crit is going to give us a heating up, which is the precursor to hot streak. Hot streak is what we get after we get 2 crits in a row. Hot streak makes it so that our next Pyroblast or Flame Strike is instant cast, and it also doubles its ignite damage, so that's good for us. We love that. The best way to get a hot streak is to cast Fire Blast whenever you already have a heating up. Makes sense so far? Okay, so Fire Mage also has more than just Fire Blast to help us generate hot streaks. We also have Critical Mass, which is our passive, gives us a flat 15% critical strike chance, and also increases the amount of critical strike rating we get from other sources by additional 10%. Each time we also cast a fireball and it doesn't crit, we get increased crit value added onto our character. Basically, this is like a bad luck prevention, if you want to put it that way when it comes to fireball. We also have talents such as Firestarter, which we already covered, which is that one where, above 90% you always crit with Fireball and Pyroblast. And we also have Searing Touch, which is the Execute talent, which basically gives us guaranteed crits if targets are below 30%. Combustion gives us 100% crit and basically lets us rapid fire spells off for insane damage. Correctly combusting is the most important skill to have as a fire mage, so I'm going to be talking about it in a quite a lot of detail here. So you always want to enter combustion with at least 2 charges of Fire Blast, and you want to have at least 1 Phoenix Flame going in. Okay, so let's talk about the opener. Now, in this video, I'm just going to mainly focus on the Venthyr opener, but we'll talk a little bit about Night Fae in just a little bit. So on the opener, we either want to precast a Pyroblast or we want to precast a Mirrors of Torment. It just depends on, what the tank is doing with the boss, how long it's going to take the boss to walk over to the tank on which one you want to cast, okay? But basically, if you're doing the Pyroblast, you want to do it from max range, and you want to do it so that your spell does not hit before your raid pulls the boss. So don't be casting Pyroblast as the boss is already pulled, right? Make sure that you're only doing this as a precast, all right? As long as your cast doesn't hit the boss because it has travel time before the boss is pulled, your raid will not be upset at you for this. All right, so no early pulling, obviously. But for Venthyr, basically, as soon as we get that done, we're going to want to cast Mirrors of Torment. Like I mentioned before, you can precast Mirrors of Torment too, right? It's up to you. But as soon as you cast Mirrors of Torment, you're wanting to cast a Fireball and then immediately Combustion and Fire Blast twice. So the reason why we want to combust while we're casting Fireball is because we need to have time to actually get the Fire Blast out. Fire Blast does have an internal cooldown of 0.5 seconds. So you can't just, let 2 go right away, okay? Like you have to give yourself enough runway to get both Fire Blasts out. So the reason why we want to do this with 2 Fire Blasts is because we want to start the fight with 2 stacks of Infernal Cascade, which is our conduit that increases our fire damage, on both the Pyroblast that you're casting, the instant cast one, and also the Fireball that you're hard casting there. Okay, so note that your first Pyroblast, if it crit, you only need 1 to get that hot streak. But if you're going to be lusting to pull, because of Mirrors of Torment, I recommend that you always just go with 2 Fire Blasts because you're going to be getting 3 stacks regardless back, okay? So if you're lusting to pull, just always go with 2. As soon as that first Pyroblast leaves your hands, you're going to want to use your Trinkets, you're going to want to use your damage ratios, your potions, just everything. Just send it all because you're going to be in your big cooldown, okay? So basically what we do as soon as that is done is we want to alternate between Pyroblast and Fire Blast while maintaining 2 stacks of Infernal Cascade. The goal here is we want to have 2 stacks of Infernal Cascade the whole time, and we want to get as many Pyroblasts off as possible while also maintaining as much combustion uptime as possible with SKB, our new legendary that we're using this tier. So this should be really easy thanks to our 4-piece bonus, because remember, our 4-piece bonus gives us cooldown reduction on Fire Blast during combustion. So if you don't have a Fire Blast available, you can use Phoenix Flames as kind of like a stopgap, but you're going to want to use your SKB as soon as it's ready. So as soon as you see your Sun King's Blessing buff ready because you consumed 8 hot streaks, you want to immediately hardcast a Pyroblast to extend the duration of combustion. It actually will extend it if you're already inside of combustion. Now keep in mind though, if your Rune of Power buff is going to expire before the hardcast finishes, remember, Rune of Power lasts 12 seconds from when you combustion, right? So if Rune of Power is going to expire before your hardcast finishes, what you're going to want to do instead is to cast Rune of Power first and then hardcast your Pyroblast. This means that you may actually have 2 Rune of Powers below your feet for maybe a second or 2, okay? But that's okay. It's totally fine if you do that, all right? And basically, as soon as that hardcast finishes, you're going to have your combustion extended, all right? Now, while you're hardcasting that Pyroblast, you may have to Fire Blast to keep your Infernal Cascade stacks at 2. Okay, so just make sure that you do that and that you're queuing up another Pyroblast as soon as the hardcast is finishing. That way you can immediately Pyroblast again. Remember, name of the game is we just want to get as many Pyroblasts as possible while also maintaining 2 stacks of Infernal Cascade. This means that we maintain the buff while also using every single hot streak without munching any procs, ideally. Okay, yeah, basically you want to get as much bang for your buck with your SKB hardcast. So if you're playing Pyroclasm, which is that talent that's really good if you're getting Power Infusion, especially if you're using Pyroclasm, try to have a Pyroclasm proc banked for your SKB, but don't hold on to it for too long, right? Like what I generally recommend is if you're in your opener, try to send your first Pyroclasm proc, if you're lucky, before you have to cast Phoenix Flames. Ideally, if we can get through a combustion without casting a single Phoenix Flames, that's like the best bang for our buck we can possibly have, okay? While also not munching Fire Blast. So you like the perfect combustion, like if you have good RNG with Pyroclasm, is you basically, as soon as you end up using all your Fire Blasts, you immediately are Pyroclasming, and then you're doing your hard cast SKB with Pyroclasm, and then you never end up having to use a Phoenix Flame because you just keep getting Pyroclasm procs, okay? That's like ideal. But obviously, you know, that's it's extremely lucky to be in that situation, right? So as a backup, you can use your Phoenix Flames if you need to. You shouldn't really run out of Phoenix Flames anymore with the 4-piece bonus, but if you do for whatever reason, especially in AoE, you're going to run out, right? So just use Scorch if that's the case. If you don't have a Phoenix Flame or Fire Blast available, just use Scorch. You do not want to waste potential SKB stacks. Very important. You want to try to use your hardcast as soon as you have SKB available, because it keeps you from consuming hot streaks while you have the hardcast buff ready, essentially munching those procs, okay? Because you will waste SKB stacks if you have SKB ready and you're just, you know, hot streaking over and over and just generating hot streaks and spending them, right? We don't want that. We want to use as many SKBs in the fight as possible, because that's going to increase our combustion uptime. So a sample sequence is going to look something like this. Mirrors of Torment here, Fireball, Combustion, Fire Blast twice, with a Pyroblast, and then another Pyroblast, and then Fire Blast, Pyroblast, Fire Blast, Pyroblast, you know, times 6, times 8, whatever it is, depending on your haste. If you have any, if you have any Pyroclasm procs, be sure to use those. And if you don't, then go with the Phoenix Flame instead. And then after that, we're going to be using Rune of Power, hardcasting Pyroblast. That's with our SKB available. And then during that hardcast, we may use a Fire Blast and then queue up a Pyroblast at the very end there. And then more Pyroblast, Fire Blast, Pyroblast, Phoenix Flame, Pyroblast, just alternating until you're done with Combustion. If you run out of both of those, then use Scorch. Now, during Combustion, I recommend either jumping or strafing while you do this, because it will prevent you from accidentally hardcasting a Pyroblast when you don't mean to, which is going to be a huge damage loss since you're essentially just idling during Combustion, which is your highest damage phase, right? If you do run out of Phoenix Flames, like I mentioned before, just sub and Scorch. You shouldn't really have this problem with 4-piece, but in AoE, you definitely will Scorch a bit. So this rotation does take a little practice, but getting it down is super important as a Fire Mage, so definitely put your practice in there, get it figured out. If you're still struggling, it's probably because you aren't popping Combustion soon enough in that first Fireball, because remember, you need to get 2 Fire Blasts off and have a Pyroblast queued for the end of that first Fireball. And Fire Blast has an internal cooldown of 0.5 seconds, so you have to pop Combustion at least 0.6 seconds out, right, if you're really fast with it, or even more if you're pretty slow with it. So, if you're having trouble, just try combusting earlier in your first Fireball. As Night Fae, you actually omit Mirrors of Torment and opt to instead go immediately into Combustion. For Night Fae, if your first Pyroblast crit, then just use 1 Fire Blast to generate your hot streak, since you're not getting like those cooldown returns on Mirrors of Torment, right? You also want to use Shifting Power as soon as you run out of Rune of Power and have used up all your Fire Blasts. So this normally is about 12 seconds into Combustion. Basically, as soon as you've spent, all your Fire Blasts, your Phoenix Flames, and then you're 12 seconds in, your Rune of Power is falling off. You want to reapply Rune of Power, immediately use Shifting Power, blast your Fire Blasts to get those off, and then, just go straight back into Combustion, essentially. For AoE, and I'm going to only touch on this very briefly because, we're going to talk more about this in a future video. Basically, you swap your Pyroblast out for Flame Strike if you have Flame Patch. Flame Strike doesn't really give us back heating up in the rotation, so it will be a little bit different. Like, you'll have to use more Scorches, right? You'll have to use more Phoenix Flames. But the name of the game as Night Phase, you just want to use your Fire Blast very aggressively inside of Combustion and AoE, because you want to get into that Shifting Power as soon as possible. Shifting Power does a lot of AoE damage, and it also generates those Fire Blasts back for us. I don't really recommend doing too much AoE as Venthyr, so pretty much all the AoE stuff is just about Night Fae, okay? So outside of your Combustion rotation, basically, you're going to be casting Fireball until you get a crit. If you see a crit, you're going to get Heating Up. You want to press Fire Blast to turn that Heating Up into a Hot Streak, and then you want to cast Power Blast. With SKB below 30%, only use Fire Blast if you're about to cap out on charges, because you want to have all your Fire Blasts ready for whenever you have SKB procced, and you will get a lot of those because you're generating a lot with Scorch. Whenever SKB is ready, what you're going to do outside of Combustion, just cast your Rune of Power if it's available, hard cast your Power Blast, and then you're basically going to have like a little mini Combustion. So just alternate Fire Blast and Phoenix Flames and throw in Scorches as you need to. Just try to get as many Pyro Blasts off as possible during Combustion. If you aren't really sure what to do, just remember your ABCs. Always be casting, right? Because if you aren't casting, you aren't doing damage. You're just losing damage. That's the biggest thing that new mages have trouble with, dealing damage. So just make sure, even if it is a spell that isn't, you know, the best spell to be casting, just make sure you're casting something, okay? If you're constantly interrupting your casts, you're losing damage. You're probably gonna have to practice a bit because Fire Mage is a little bit technical. So, you know, there's no shame in practicing on the target dummies and getting better at the class. All right, thank you all for watching. If you like this guide, be sure to give it a thumbs up. And also make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so that you can be notified as soon as part 2 is available, where we'll be going more in depth into the AOE rotation and just rotation stuff in general. Also, that way you won't miss guides about Arcane and Frost whenever those come out, and also my content for Dragonflight. So I hope you guys are ready and you know, excited to see that content there. I'm certainly excited to play, and I can't wait to mess around with the new talents. It's gonna be great. So yeah, thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.